I'm going to talk to you this evening on the subject of the spectrum of love. We know that from time to time there arise among human beings people who seem to exude love as naturally as the sun gives out heat. We would like to be like that, and by and large, man's religions are attempts to cultivate that same power in ordinary people. But unfortunately, they normally go about this task as one would attempt to make the tail wag the dog. I remember when I was a small boy in school, I was enormously interested in being able to do my schoolwork properly. And everybody told me that I didn't work hard enough and that I ought to work. I had an intense desire to do this, but when I asked, "How do you work?" everybody shut up like a clam. So I was extremely puzzled, but there were teachers who apparently knew how to work and had attained considerable heights of scholarship, and I admired them very much for their attainments. And so I thought that maybe I could learn the secret by copying their mannerisms. I would imitate the style of handwriting that they used. I would use the same kind of pen. I would affect the same mannerisms of speech and gesture, and insofar as I could get around the school uniform, even of clothing. I must assure you this, of course, was a private school in England, not a public school in America. But none of this revealed the secret, because I was, as it were, copying the outward symptoms and knew nothing of the inner fountain of being able to work. And exactly the same thing is true in the case of people who love. When we study the behavior of people who have the power of love within them, we can catalogue how they behave in various situations, and out of this catalogue formulate some rules. One of the peculiar things we notice about people who have this astonishing universal love is that they are apt, but not always so, but they are apt very often to play it rather cool on sexual love. The reason for this is, generally speaking, unknown to preachers, but it is because an erotic relationship with the external world operates, so far as they're concerned, between that world and every single nerve ending. Their whole organism, in all its aspects, physical, psychological and spiritual, is an erogenous zone. And therefore their flow of love is not specialized or canalized so exclusively in the genital system as it is with most other people. Especially in a culture such as ours, where for so many centuries that particular expression of erotic love has been so marvelously repressed as to make it seem the most desirable kind of love that there is. And so we have, as a result of 2,000 years of Christianity, sex on the brain. It isn't always the right place for it. Of course, also, people who exude love are apt to give things away. They are, in every way, like rivers. They stream. And so when they collect possessions and things that they like, they are apt to give them to other people, because if you ever notice that when you start giving things away, you keep getting more. In the same way as you empty you create a vacuum, nature abhors a vacuum, and more flows in. So, noticing this, the codifiers of loving behavior write down that you should give so much money to tax-deductible institutions and to the poor, and that you should be nice to people, that you should act towards your relatives and your friends, and indeed even your enemies, as if you love them, even if you don't. And of course, for Christians and Jews and believers in God, there is a peculiarly difficult task enjoined upon us, namely, that thou shalt love the Lord thy God. And not only here, going through the motions of it externally, but with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. And that is, of course, very demanding indeed. But you see what is happening. It is as if, for example, we admired the music of a certain composer, and having studied his style very thoroughly, we draw up rules of musical composition based on the behavior of this composer. We then go to send our children to music school, where they learn these rules, in the hope that if they apply them, they also will turn into first-class musicians, which they usually fail to do. Because what might be called the technique of music, as well as the technique of morals, as well as, say, the technique of speech, of language, is very valuable because it gives you something to express if, and I repeat, if you have anything to express. But if you don't have anything to say, not even the greatest mastery of English will stand you in good stead, unless you can manage to fool your listeners by talking beautiful nonsense and make it sound profound. Now, so the question and the puzzle remains. You cannot imitate this thing. There is no way of getting it, and yet it is absolutely essential that we have it. Because obviously, the human race is not going to flourish harmoniously unless we are enabled to love each other. But the question is, how do you get it? Is it something you simply have to contract like measles? Or is, as theologians say, is it a gift of divine grace, which somehow is dished out to some but not to others? And if there is no way of getting divine grace by anything you do, as the Calvinists aver, then we'd better just sit around and wait until something happens. Although Calvinists never did that. They were almost depressingly energetic. But surely we can't be left in that kind of a hopeless situation. There must be some way of getting the grace, or getting divine charity or love, some sort of wangle, some sort of way in which we can, as it were, open ourselves so as to become conduit pipes for the flow. And so the more subtle preachers try to see if we can open ourselves and teach methods of meditation and spiritual discipline in the hope that we can contact this power. The less subtle preachers simply say, you don't have enough faith, you don't have enough guts, you don't have enough willpower. If you only put your your shoulder to the wheel and shoved, you would be, of course, an exemplar and a saint. Actually, you will only be an extremely clever hypocrite. The whole history of religion is a history of the failure of preaching. Preaching is moral violence. If when you deal with the so-called practical world and people don't behave as you would wish they would, you get out the army, or the police force, or the big stick, and if those strike you as somewhat crude, you resort to giving lectures. And I mean lectures in the sense of a pie jaw, a solemn adjuration and exhortation to behave better next time. Now, let us look at some of the practical consequences of adjuring people and commanding people to love. Many a parent says to the child, nice children love their mothers. And, of course, I'm sure you're a nice child. You ought to love your mother, but not because I, your mother, say so, but because you really want to do so. Because one of the difficulties is none of us in our heart of hearts respect love which is not freely given. If, for example, you are an ailing parent and you need to be looked after and you have a son or daughter, who feels dutifully that they should look after you because, after all, you've done so much for them. But this somehow, your living with your father or mother prevents you from having a home and a life of your own. Naturally, you resent this duty, and your parent is well aware that you resent it, even if they pretend to ignore it. They therefore feel guilty that they have imposed upon your loyalty, and you, in turn, can't really disclose from yourself the fact that you hate them for getting sick, even though they couldn't help it. And therefore nobody enjoys the relationship. It is a painful duty carried out. And the same thing would naturally happen if, after a number of years, having at the altar made a solemn and terrible promise that you would love your wife and husband, come what may, forever and ever, till death do you part, and then suddenly you find you really haven't the heart in you to do it anymore, then you feel guilty, and that you ought to love your wife, family, or whatever. And naturally, this is a sort of fiasco, as would be obvious, if you were to ask your wife, do you really love me? And she were to reply, I'm trying very hard to do so. You see, the difficulty of it is this. You cannot teach a selfish person to be unselfish by any means. That is to say, whatever a selfish person does, whether it be giving his body to be burned or giving all that he possesses to the poor, he will still do it in a selfish way of feeling. And he will be able to do this with extreme cunning, a marvelous self-deception, and deception of others besides. But the consequences of fake love are almost invariably destructive, because they build up resentment on the part of the person who does the fake loving, as well as on the part of those who are its recipients. This is why the foreign aid program has been such a dismal failure. Now, of course, you may say that I'm talking in a very impractical way, because you would say, well, do we just have to sit around and wait until we become inwardly converted and learn through the grace of God, on some sort of magic, how to love, and in the meantime do nothing about it and conduct ourselves as selfishly as we feel? There is, as a matter of fact, something to be said for that. Because the first problem in the whole of this is honesty. And the reason why the Lord God says at the beginning of things, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart and with all thy soul and with all thy mind, is not because the Lord God is stupid, but because he's very clever. That which appears to be a commandment is actually a challenge, or what in Zen Buddhism would be called a koan, a spiritual problem. Because if you exercise yourself resolutely in trying to love God and or your neighbor, you will find that you get more and more tangled up. You will realize increasingly that the reason why you are attempting to obey this as a commandment is that you want to be the right kind of person. And obviously you want to be the right kind of person for your own reasons. And so if you do, in the first place, feel selfish and come to the conclusion, as a result of trying various experiments with love, that you love yourself more than anybody else, the proper thing to do is to investigate your self-love, to find out why you love yourself and what you mean by yourself when you say you love yourself. For the reason is this: love is not something that is a sort of rare commodity. Everybody has it. Existence is love. But it's like water flowing through a hose. It depends in which direction you point it. So everybody has the force running. And maybe the way in which you find the force of love operating in you is that you have a passionate like of booze, or ice cream, or automobiles, or good-looking members of the opposite sex, or even the same sex. But there is love operating. And people, of course, tend to distinguish between the various kinds of love. There are good kinds, such as divine charity, and allegedly bad kinds, such as, in quotes, animal lust. But it should be understood, I think, that they are all forms of the same thing. But they differ in rather the same way that the colors of light, of white light, divide into the spectrum when passed through a prism. So we might say that the red end of the spectrum of love is Dr. Freud's libido. And the violet end of the spectrum of love is agape, what is called divine love or divine charity. And that in the middle, the various yellows, blues and greens are friendship, human endearment, consideration, and all that sort of fellow feeling. But it's all the same thing. And so, the thing is, first of all, to get it moving, to follow whatever kind of love you have in the first place. Because you cannot control love until you have some to control, until you have it running. You've got to get your car running before you can learn how to drive it. You will not become a skillful driver by sitting at a still car in a garage any more than you will become a skilled dancer if you simply never move your arms and legs. And so, the first thing then is to discover what indeed you do love, if anything, and you will find there is something. And then go into the nature of that. Now, it's said that selfish people love themselves. I would say that that is really a misunderstanding of the whole thing, because yourself is something that is really impossible to love. There are various reasons for this, but one obvious reason is that loving oneself is as difficult as kissing your own lips. Oneself, when you try to focus on it, to love it or to know it, is oddly elusive. It always slips away like the pursued tail of a dog who is trying to get hold of his own tail. So to pursue your own end has some difficulties about it. If you explore what you love when you say you love yourself, you will make the startling discovery that everything you love is something which you thought was other than yourself. Even if it be very ordinary things such as ice cream or booze, in the conventional sense, booze is not you, nor is ice cream. It turns into you in a manner of speaking when you consume it, but then you don't have it anymore. And so you look around for more in order to love it once again. But so long as you love it, you see, it's never you. When you love people, even however selfishly you love them, because of the pleasant sensations they give to you, still, it is somebody else that you love. And as you inquire into this, as you follow honestly your own selfishness, many interesting transformations begin to come about in you. One of the most interesting transformations of being directly and honestly selfish, in the same way that, for example, cats are, is that you stop deceiving people. A great deal of damage is done in practical human relations by saying that you love people, when what you mean is that you ought to, and you don't really. You give the wrong impression, and people begin to expect things of you which you're never going to come through with. We have been taught, for example, that we ought to love our enemies. Now, we don't really understand what it means to love our enemies. We think it means to be charitable towards them in the hope that we will convert them, and so that they will cease to be our enemies. The real reason for loving enemies is that one needs enemies. They're terribly important to you. For example, I think that some of you here feel that you belong to a nice set of people. It may be an ordinary kind of bourgeois coterie of pleasant squares, or it may be a church group of some kind, a club, or a special cult, or just a group of friendly drinkers. But at any rate, you feel that by virtue of membership in this society, you belong to a special in-group of nice or saved people. Now, when you consider what nice people talk about when they sit round the dinner table and have an opportunity to nurture their collective ego, you will find that the most fascinating topic of conversation is the nasty people. How awful they are, what dreadful things they do, and what is it all coming to. And this very, very satisfactory, condemnatory conversation nurtures your ego. But people who do that don't seem to realize that they thereby depend on the nasty people in order to know that they're nice. They are, as a matter of fact, highly indebted to them. On the other side of the picture, the nasty people, they, on their side, consider that they really are the best people and could nurture their collective ego by blasting the bourgeoisie, the squares, the wasps, the know-nothings, or whoever they may be. So, for the collective ego of the non-squares, the squares are extremely necessary. If they were to disappear tomorrow, many of us would lose a cause. Now, the minute you begin to become aware of this, it's rather embarrassing. It's, of course, humorous, and I'm glad that you see this. Because at once you begin to realize how much you depend on an enemy, or an outsider, or a group of damned people as distinct from your own group of saved people. And so you begin to realize that if your collective ego, or yourself, depends on your being on the in, but you can only be on the in with relation to something that is out. And since the in and the out are inseparable, if there is to be any in or any out, you suddenly discover that yourself is bigger than you thought it was. It includes the other, and you can't do without it. This brings about a fundamental change in the understanding of the meaning and nature of self. And thereupon, there become a change of attitude to other people, even if you continue with some formal opposition to them and disapproval of them. When then you are honestly clear with yourself what you like and what you dislike, and then at the same time yourself begins more and more to include things that were hitherto defined as being not yourself, your love, which is what you are, begins to express itself quite naturally and unaffectedly in a wider way. Now, to trust oneself to be capable of love, to bring up love, in other words, to function in a sociable way and in a creative way, is to take a risk. It's a gamble. Because you may not come through with it. And in the same way, when you fall in love with somebody else, or you form an association with somebody else, and you trust them, they may, as a matter of fact, not fulfill your expectations. But that risk has to be taken. The alternative to taking that risk is much worse than trusting and being deceived. In other words, to live together, you have to take risks. There will be disappointments and failures and disasters as a result of taking these risks. But in the long run it will work out. My point is that if you don't take them, the results will be so much worse than any kind of wild anarchy that could be conceived. You see, here we are now as a highly disciplined human race, with all kinds of rules and religions. And what are we about to do? Blow ourselves completely to pieces. Is this freedom? Was this all a good gamble? Because you see, in tying up love in knots and becoming incapable of it, you can't destroy this energy. You turn it, when you won't love and you won't let it out, the thing comes out in the form of self-destruction. The alternative to self-love, in other words, is self-destruction. Because you won't take the risk of loving yourself properly, you will be compelled instead to destroy yourself. Because you see, in tying up love in knots and becoming incapable of it, you can't destroy this energy. You turn it, when you won't love and you won't let it out, the thing comes out in the form of self-destruction. The alternative to self-love, in other words, is self-destruction. Because you won't take the risk of loving yourself properly, you will be compelled instead to destroy yourself. So, which would you rather have? Would you rather have a human race which isn't always very well controlled and sometimes runs amok a little bit, but on the whole continues to be good, with a good deal of honesty and delight when delight is available? Or would you rather have the whole human race blown to pieces and cleaned off the planet, reducing the whole thing to a nice scoured rock with no dirty disease on it called life? But I repeat the point that is necessary to understand this whole thing, that love is a spectrum. There is not, as it were, nice love and nasty love, spiritual love and material love, mature affection on the one hand and infatuation on the other. These are all forms of the same energy. And you have to take it and let it grow where you find it. If you find that only one of these forms exists in you, if at least you will water it, the rest of the plant will blossom as well. But the essential prerequisite from the beginning is to let it have its way. Have its way.
I received a visit from a woman who, as a result of listening to these talks, was wondering if I could help her to regain an experience which she had had while undergoing a surgical operation. As is generally known, anesthetics sometimes induce peculiarly vivid and unusual states of consciousness. And every now and then a person under anesthesia will undergo a specific and particular experience which is of the utmost fascination. It's the kind of experience which I suppose we would ordinarily call mystical or spiritual, and which, while it lasts, carries the most powerful sensation of understanding with complete clarity and certainty what is the mystery and meaning of the world. This occurs sufficiently often to have been made a subject of experimentation. Perhaps you know the story of the investigator who took doses of anesthetic for this purpose and equipped himself with pencil and paper to record at the moment of awakening whatever revelation might have been given to him. Fortunately, the expected experience took place, and for a brief period the investigator had the vivid conviction of complete comprehension of this universe of life and death. He regained waking consciousness with the tail end of the sensation still upon him, grabbed the pencil, and swiftly recorded the essential content of the experience just before it faded. After several minutes, during which his mind returned to its normal state, he looked at what he had written. And there upon the paper was the following immensely profound observation. Everything in this universe is the smell of burnt almonds. I suppose that all sensible and hard-headed people would agree that this is just the sort of inanity to which all these mystical revelations ultimately boil down. In the clear, cold light of rational consciousness, the seemingly inspired and utter convincing knowledge of dreams, of drug delusions, and of mystical experiences comes down to just this sort of idiotic anticlimax, masked in the poetic or exotic obscurantism of such phrases as all is Brahman or the divine unity beneath the multiplicity of the world. It may sound for a moment as if it meant something, but the essential nonsense of these feelings and the purely subjective character of the sense of insight which they involve at once becomes obvious when Brahman, the divine unity, is replaced by the smell of burnt almonds. We might settle for this conclusion if some of us had not had the same sensation, not under drugs or hypnosis, but when very wide awake. And I, for one, will not quarrel with the smell of burned almonds as the key to the mystery. I like it much better and feel it makes much more sense than Brahma or the divine. For its very banality, its very consequential silliness, brings out the real significance of the experience in question. For the importance of the mystical revelation does not lie in the precise nature of what everything in this universe is. It can be God or Brahman or burnt almonds or applesauce or anything you like. Its importance lies rather in the simple sensation of wholeness, in the part of the sentence which runs, everything in this universe is, no matter what. For the conviction which has come to the experiencer is that his habitual sensation of isolation from his environment, from the rest of the world, is an illusion, and that as a corollary, his own deeds and misdeeds, fortunes and misfortunes, are the same process as the changing seasons and the searching stars. And unreasonable as it may seem, this gives him the sensation that his whole life, past, present, and future, is somehow perfectly natural and in order, and that he himself is not just the mind toad in the sky, but the total process of the world. The significance of this experience does not, I think, lie in any consequences or conclusions which might be drawn from it. It is not an important experience in the sense that it is useful for some other purpose. It's simply like playing or listening to music, which is obviously phony in the very moment that we do it for some ulterior motive, such as to appear cultured or convey an ideological message. Its significance for human beings is not like that of, say, the second law of thermodynamics, but like that of the Mozart sonatas or the arabesques on a Persian rug. The significance of useful knowledge, like the second law of thermodynamics, is precisely that by applying it, human beings may be enabled to go on experiencing such things as music or love or mystical insight. But what could I say to the woman who, under anesthetic, had once had this experience and wanted it again more than anything else in the world? Go and have another operation, get yourself some ether, or mescaline, or lysergic acid, or take up yoga, or get thee to a nunnery. There are still other, and much too pat, answers to this question, as that she is failing to revive the experience by the very act of seeking for it. As well tell a starving man that his very hunger is what prevents him from finding food. For once a person has had an experience of this kind, he is gone. It's easier to get rid of an addiction to heroin, or to choose something more natural, to get rid of the love of the opposite sex. No, I could better say something like this. The answer is in the very experience which you have had. Didn't you know then, for certain, with utter clarity, that your whole life, past, present, and future, was somehow, as you yourself put it, part and parcel of that universal harmony which the Chinese call the Tao? I feel sometimes that phrases like universal harmony are so hackneyed, so almost slushy and sentimental, that it's terribly difficult to begin to find the right word for this kind of thing without sounding like Voltaire's Mr. Pangloss, without sort of jumping on this best of all possible worlds business, because the thing isn't like that at all. It's very, very much stronger than the feeling that this is the best of all possible worlds. And the curious thing about it isn't that it glosses over anything, but it makes the most awful things seem that way too, without at the same time making them cease to seem terrible. It's very peculiar. Well, she had seen, for certain, at the time of that experience, seen with total clarity, that our whole past, present, and future life was in some way part and parcel of what we are perforce driven to call the universal harmony of the Tao. But what one doesn't seem to understand then is that this still remains true of what one is today. You are in the stream when seeking for what you have lost, and when feeling perfectly ordinary, no less than when you were in ecstasy. You are not feeling the experience, and your striving to regain it is, as a matter of fact, the very future which you saw to be in such perfect accord with the process. Let me remind you of a celebrated tale that was told by Sri Ramakrishna. The story of one of his disciples who had learned from the Master that all the multiplicity of this world is the illusory outward form of the one eternal divine Brahman underlying the entire process. And having sat and listened to this exposition, the disciple got up and went his way, and in passing down a rather narrow street, he saw an elephant coming towards him, and Mahout riding on top of the elephant. Well, the Mahout saw the disciple wandering down the center of the road and shouted at him, "Hey you, get out of the way! This elephant isn't very nice." But the disciple thought, now the Master Ramakrishna has told me that I am Brahman, and that everything is Brahman, and therefore the elephant is Brahman, and therefore it will be perfectly all right if I walk straight along. The elephant will do me no harm, since I realize this to be true. So he ignored the warning of the Mahout and approached the elephant, and the elephant swung his trunk and swatted that disciple hard and threw him into the ditch where he was scratched with the brambles. Well, he was very upset, and he came crawling back to Sri Ramakrishna and said, "Master, you have deceived me. I understood that everything is Brahman, that I am Brahman, all other creatures. Is that not so, Master?" And the Master said, "Yes, it is so." Well, he said, "I was walking out on the road and I saw this elephant coming towards me. And it didn't seem to me to be necessary to get out of the way when the Mahout riding the elephant warned me to do so, because I figured that I was Brahman and the elephant was Brahman and I could come to no harm." "You stupid man," said Sri Ramakrishna. "You didn't realize that the voice of the Mahout was also Brahman, and you should have heeded that too. So also in this case, the one who is trying to regain the vision is the disciple, and the vision they're trying to regain is the elephant. But the way you are actually feeling now, and which you are ignoring because of your eagerness to feel some other way, that is the voice of the Mahout, and that too is Brahman. 9 times out of 10, an observation of this kind will mean nothing, and will fall as flat as being told that everything in this universe is the smell of burnt almonds. But the 10th time, it will dawn upon you as a statement of total and luminous clarity. I do not think we need have any fear that this 10th time will never come, for in other circumstances it has come again and again. Think back to school days, when with the utmost care your teacher explained over and over the mysteries of percentage or sentence structure or daylight saving time, and you consistently failed to see the point. And then suddenly something clicked in your mind, and the principle became clear. There is a Chinese poem which says, "Words do not make a man understand. It takes the man to understand the words."
Now, today, we are living in an age which is quite peculiar. Because in the world of science, there are no longer any secrets. Because the method of science requires that all scientists be in communication with each other. And therefore, that every scientist, as soon as he has discovered something or got a good idea, he rushes into print. And it's important for him to do so, because some other scientist somewhere else in the world might be thinking about something on the same lines and would be stimulated in his work by this man's speculations, even if not by discoveries. And so the whole scientific world tries to remain in communication. And for this reason, it was absolutely impossible to keep atomic energy a secret. In former ages, that might have been managed, because there were many secrets once upon a time. And people were not admitted to these secrets unless they were in some way tested and found capable of handling them without running amok. We live in such a dangerous age because all the secrets are out in the open and anybody can run amok with them. And that's just the situation we have to face, and that is just the situation we have to handle. It is too late to stop it, because that would be, as they say, locking the door after the horse has bolted. The vice president of an extremely important corporation in the United States, very progressive and very vital, a few months ago said, there are two major forces operating in the world today, for good or for evil. One is Red China, the other is LSD. And there is a certain reason why such a thing as a certain chemical, which is capable of opening people's minds in a certain way, should be something extremely disturbing. Because this particular chemical, in common with a number of others that have been known for centuries, but have been rather played cool through those centuries, is capable of doing something which simply cannot be tolerated. That is to say, capable of letting properly prepared individuals, or sometimes improperly prepared individuals, in on a secret which is very closely guarded, and which is, as a matter of fact, the deepest and most fundamental of all our social taboos. I have just finished writing a book, which I've had, with a sort of tongue-in-cheek attitude, had the temerity to call The Book. And it is subtitled, The Book, you see, on the taboo against knowing who you are. Because that is really the thing that cannot be let out. Sex is not really a serious taboo in our culture. If you are initiating a young person into life, and you realize that your son or daughter is going to college, and that you ought therefore to have a serious talk with them, they'll laugh at you and say, all this thing you're telling us about sex, we knew years ago, and we know more about it than you do. So that is not a subject for a serious initiation talk to a young person. So we have to think again and try and find out, think deeply, what is fundamentally taboo in this culture, and perhaps in other cultures as well. What information, in other words, would really let the cat out of the bag and give away the show? Now, quest around a bit. Ask yourself this: for what reason would a person be considered hopelessly insane? What sort of claims must a person simply not make? Well, there is one, and that is if anybody claims that he is God. That simply isn't done. certainly not in our culture, although it's very frequent in India. But in our culture, that is simply not allowed, because we, most of us, from a Christian background, and if not that, from a Jewish background, and there's a great deal in common. Because both Christians and Jews are deeply concerned about somebody called Jesus Christ. Both Christians and Jews are in a way followers of Jesus Christ in different ways. He is a problem to both. Because he was the man who came out and discovered he was God. And that simply is impermissible. The Jews handled it in one way. The Christians handled it quite as effectively in another way. The Christians handled Jesus perfectly, even more tactfully than the Jews, by putting him on a pedestal and saying this was the only man who ever was God, and nobody else was really so before, and certainly nobody can be so afterwards. Stop right there. Put him on the altar, bow down to him, worship him, so that everything he had to say will be null and void. And it worked beautifully. But you see, the trouble about deep secrets is they can't be repressed indefinitely. Now here's the problem, you see, that there are certain processes, some of which are what you might call spiritual exercises. Others are simply chemicals. Others are just horse sense, whereby one comes to see very clearly indeed that black goes with white and self goes with other. And as this becomes clear to you, it's rather shaking. Because, look, if what you define as you is inseparable from everything which you define as not you, just as front is inseparable from back, then you realize that deep down between self and other there is some sort of conspiracy. If these things always occur in combination and look very different from each other and feel quite different, nevertheless, the feeling of difference between them allows each one to exist. And so underneath the opposition or the polarity between self and other, or between any other pair of opposites you can think of, there is something in common, as there is, for example, between figure and background. You can't see a figure without a background. You can't have an organism without an environment. Equally, you can't have a background without figure, or an environment without organisms in it, or without things in it. You can't have space which is unoccupied by any solid. You cannot have solids not occupying some space. This is absolutely elementary, and yet we don't realize it. Because, for example, the average person thinks that space is nothing. That it's just a sort of not there-ness in which there are things. And we are slightly afraid that not there-ness, that nothingness, that darkness, that the negative poles of all these oppositions will win. That they will eventually swallow up every kind of being and every kind of there-ness. But when you catch on to the game, you realize that that won't happen. Because what is called not existing is quite incapable of being there without the contrast of something called existing. It's like the crest and the trough of a wave. You can't have a wave that's all trough and no crest, just as you can't have a wave which is all crest and no trough. Such a thing has never been manifested in the physical universe. They go together. And that is the secret. There really is no other secret than that. But it is thoroughly repressed. And therefore, we are all educated to feel that we've got to fight for the white because the black might win. We've got to survive. You must survive. That's the great thing we're all working under, and pounding it out day after day in anxiety. Because this is a description of anxiety. Anxiety is the fear that one of a pair of opposites might cancel the other forever. And if by any chance, by any means, you find out that that is not so, you have an entirely new attitude to what human beings are doing, which may be very creative, but which also may be very dangerous. You see through the game called white must win, because you know that neither black nor white are going to win, because they belong to each other. So one of the problems of the various chemicals which can change the human mind in certain ways so that it becomes apparent that inside and outside go together is that they do rather give the show away, and people who take these chemicals and see through the human game cannot be trusted. They may decide to be good sports and go back into the game and play it as if it were for real. Or they may not. And if they don't, what's going to happen? Now, you see, what is, let me speak specifically for a moment. I said the subject of this is LSD. LSD is one such chemical that does produce this curious effect of making you aware of the polarity of things. It does lots of other things. It does lots of rather unessential and trivial things. And these, of course, in all the publicity in the various national magazines about LSD, get thoroughly emphasized. In other words, when somebody says something's real psychedelic, they mean bizarre. And when the national magazines try to illustrate the effect of these chemicals with various photographs, they come on with blurred photographs of all sorts of things higgledy-piggledy messed together. Naked girls seen through prisms. Well, that's absolutely nothing to do with it. If you wanted some sort of appropriate illustration for a Life magazine article on the effects of LSD, you would have one very simple solution. You would publish the most gorgeous color reproductions of Persian miniatures and of the Moorish arabesques and of the illuminations of Celtic manuscripts. That would give you the story, so far as changes in human sensation are concerned. But there would be one thing very difficult to put across in pictures, because the people who looked at them, if they didn't get the point of view, wouldn't see it. And that is what I will call the sensation, as well as the intellectual understanding of polarity. That is to say, that the inside and the outside, the subjective and the objective, the self and the other, go together. In other words, there is a harmony, an unbreakable harmony. When I'm using the word harmony, I don't necessarily mean something sweet. I mean absolute concordant relationship between what goes on inside your skin and what goes on outside your skin. It isn't that what goes on outside is so powerful that it pushes around and controls what goes on inside. Equally so, it isn't that what goes on inside is so strong that it often succeeds in pushing around what goes on outside. It is very simply that the two processes, the two behaviors, are one. What you do is what the universe does. And what the universe does is also what you do. Not you in the sense of your superficial ego, which is a very small, little tiny area of your conscious sensitivity, but you in the sense of your total.